Jizo's most intimate. Jizo asked Shōgen, "Where are you going?" Shōgen said, "I'm wandering at random." Jizo said, "What do you think of wandering?" Shōgen said, "I don't know." Jizo said, "Not knowing is most intimate." Shōgen was suddenly enlightened. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the gift of your presence. And it feels like a gift. Of course, when I say that, I always think of the meal chant that we just did twice already today. May we, with all living beings, realize the emptiness of the three wheels: giver, receiver, and gift. But thank you for your attention, and thank you for really sharing, for those of you that I met face to face, to really opening up. And how's it going? I wanted to give some special thanks to our Jukai recipients tomorrow. All 5 of them are here, and I know most of them. Jenny and Yoko and David G, not to be confused with David H, who's over here. And I don't know if you knew that David G and I are half brothers. We were talking about that. His last name is Goodsmith, and my last name is Bloodgood. Got your car fixed? And with a Zazenkai, we don't have a meeting at the end where we can kind of share. At 5 o'clock, we're out of here. So I wanted to give thanks to those that have helped put this together. And it's, as they say, it takes a village. Jitsu Joe has done a wonderful job as head monitor. There's a lot of moving parts here. And she was there on the spot. As some of you know that Kanjo, my good friend, was a little bit under the weather, so everything just was seamless. Earth Mirror ended up, Jisha, Etsugen ended up going over as monitor. Special thanks to Senshin, wherever she is. Hopefully she's on stage for her dream. She likes to be there. Even for this one day, it's almost as difficult to do a one-day Zazenkai as a sesshin. It really takes a lot of effort. Sarah's our Tenzo. Thank you so much. And Duetsu was an assistant. Shōgen, where are you? There you are. Was a head server. Myoho, monitor, and the Oryoki instructor. And of course, we can't forget Roshi, who really makes all of this possible. So, why are you here? What brings you to Great Dragon Mountain on this beautiful, warm June summer afternoon? You could be doing a lot of other stuff other than sitting here. So what brings you to practice? Don't know? Well, of course, the Zazenkai literally means coming together for meditation. Some of us come for peace of mind. You found any peace today? When I talk to people, a lot of stuff comes up, has been coming up. I do a lot of prison work, and in working with the inmates, we have new inmates that come in to sit. And their first kind of exposure to it is, I think I mentioned this to somebody face-to-face today, I'm so relaxed. My blood pressure is starting to drop. My anger issues, not as bad. And I look at him and I say, stick with it. All your shit's going to come up. And of course, that's what happens, right? Our life comes up. My mom, bless her heart, I have to share this story. She passed away 2 years ago. But my brother is a fundamentalist Christian pastor. And it gets better. He's actually has a band, a heavy metal Christian rock band. But he's a pastor. And then I'm the Zen priest. So Mom would oftentimes shake her head when she was talking to people and said, I think I dropped both of you boys on your head. A Christian pastor and a Zen priest. And people would ask Mom, says, well, what's your Zen priest do? And she would say, he sits on his arse. Which is what we've been doing here today. But of course, there's serious sides to this, serious intent. Keizan Zenji said, we practice Zen to realize our true self, whatever that is. What is it that we realize? Well, we can read about it. We're told that we realize the total emptiness of subject and object. That sounds pretty cool. And Yamada Koan, a lot of us use one of his books as we study our own koans. He says that all koans must be seen from the standpoint of emptiness before they can realize reveal their riches to us. And he often, and those of you that read him will know that very often he talks about this example of the fraction. And the numerator on top, denominator on the bottom. The numerator is the phenomenal world. All the stuff, the things of the world. And the denominator, the world of oneness. We call it many things. Buddha nature, our true nature. John Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And that's kind of that fraction. And Yamada oftentimes says the denominator is what we're opening up to the essence. That's kind of the Satori or Kensho experience. But we spend most of our time, of course, in the numerator, in the phenomenal world. But he always stresses it's the whole fraction. It's not one or the other. So in this koan, not knowing, of course, comes up, and I don't know. There's another very famous koan, the very first one in the Blue Cliff record, Bodhidharma's Vast and Void. And he has an encounter with Emperor Bu of China. And at one point, the emperor asks him, who are you facing me? Bodhidharma says, I don't know. Later, the emperor is talking with his attendant, Shiko. And Shiko says, does your majesty know who that man is? And the emperor said, I don't know. But I think you can probably glean the difference from one I don't know to the other. Bodhidharma, different meaning. So a little bit more about that koan. Hogen Zenji. There were originally 5 Zen schools and 7 branches of Zen. And ultimately, the Hogen school was one of them. Each one had its own kind of particular flavor. One characteristic of the Hogen school was it was extreme clarity in presenting this matter of oneness. Now, Hogen was originally a disciple of another master, Choki, but he just didn't get his peace of mind, didn't feel that this is it, so he went off meandering on pilgrimage, looking for a teacher. Really not unlike Dogen, who took off from Japan and went to China looking for his teacher. So eventually, as I read it, that he kind of stumbles upon Jizo's temple. He didn't really know about him, but he ends up there. And after the exchange that I just had read, this not knowing is most intimate, he was going to leave after that. And he had an awakening, but he's walking away, and Jizo accompanies him to the gate of the temple, what they do just kind of out of respect. There happened to be a large stone by the temple gate entrance. Jizo, the teacher, said to Hogen, "You monks usually say the whole universe is just one mind. Tell me, is this stone within the mind or outside of the mind?" Hogen said, "Within the mind." Then Jizo replies, "It will be awfully difficult for you to travel around with such a big stone inside of you." Well, Hogen said, I think this guy's got something. He ends up staying and practicing with Jizo and becoming his Dharma heir. And ultimately, as we say in Zen, he had his full and complete enlightenment, the breaking through the bottom of the bucket. So not knowing is most intimate. This intimacy, what's that about? We all have kind of our ideas about being intimate, closely acquainted, being very familiar with somebody, or to anything, involving a very, very close connection. What came up for me was actually sexual imagery, this idea of becoming one with, two becoming one. But when I had first started putting this talk together, and actually not so much the talk, but just this idea about not knowing and thinking a lot about that, I had wanted to use another koan. And it was actually, many of you know, Roshi Igyoku is putting together household of koans. And in the pre-circle, some of us were actually helping her edit these. And there's now another core group. I didn't make that cut, but there's a core group helping her further edit these. And one really, really spoke to me. And she asked that because the book's not published, not to use it specifically. But she said you can refer to it. And so I'd like to do that. In this sense, it really, really spoke to me. And this was about a physician that's receiving a new patient. And the patient had very aggressive rectal cancer. And she hasn't met him yet, but she's going through the medical charts, realizing that he's not responding to chemotherapy and radiation treatments. His kidneys are just laden with tumors, and he left his living with his wife and moves in with the parents because the wife can no longer care for him. So she's a good physician. She looks at the charts and she said, this guy's ready for hospice. He's on his way out. So finally she goes in to see the patient face to face, and there is the patient. she says, "Good morning, Chad. How are you?" And here's the patient with this huge, beautiful smile on his face. And he said, "I'm doing really well, Doc. Last night, it was the first night in months that I slept over the whole night, through the whole night. I didn't get up once to pee." So the doctor had kind of an awakening. She had her, of course, role as a doctor. That's what she came into the room with. And he kind of burst her bubble. And she was able to drop that role. Now, there's another story that's quite the opposite, and I'll be referring to Frank Ostaseski a lot. I read his book, The 5 Invitations, I think 3 times now. Frank was one of the co-founders of the Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco. Kind of started during the height of the AIDS epidemic up there. So some pretty gnarly stories. I've known other people that were up there during that time. Pretty tough stuff. But this story is about another physician. The patient in this is Jackson. And Jackson worked in a wire hanger factory, making wire hangers. And so he's in the hospice house, and he has 3 TVs in his room. And he's designed rabbit ear antenna. Remember those? Maybe some of you don't. But of course he has total access to all these hangers, so he's got them all wired. And Jackson loved to watch horror movies at night. He'd have the movies on all the time. And often 3 at the same time. And then in the morning he'd be all groggy and complain of these terrible nightmares. And Frank had suggested, well, maybe you should turn the TVs off before sleeping. And I guess Jackson looked at him and said, "What, are you crazy?" "No, man, the TV helps me get to sleep." And he goes on, Frank goes on to say that it was keeping him company, and perhaps this was the longest relationship he'd ever had. And his terminal cancer scared him. He was fearful that others would abandon him because of this disease that he had. And he had a thing about not wanting to disappoint others, especially his oncologist, who basically he felt had his life in her hands. So he's going to go back to the oncologist's office. And interestingly, this had to have been some time ago, because nowadays with Medicare, that would be considered aggressive treatment, kind of going back to an oncologist. And you would have to, we call it graduate from hospice. You'd have to come off if you wanted to have some kind of further treatments. But Jackson hadn't eaten in a week. He was feeling nauseous most of the time. He was very weak, unable to walk. So again, physician's office, and in walks the physician, who was clearly upset when she saw his decline. Gaunt body, protruding eyes, and the changes in mood caused by his glioblastoma. During the time she was in the office, about 15 minutes, barely made eye contact with Jackson. So she kept her fear well concealed behind her white coat. Speaking abruptly, after hearing what was going on with him, she suggested a new course of intensive radiation, and in order to shrink the brain tumor. Well, Jackson responded and said he was nauseous and tired and just wanted to rest. The oncologist bowls him over, writes her prescription, for an anti-nausea medication and scheduled radiation treatment for the following day. Frank took Jackson home, and he passed away that night. So as he said, it was pretty difficult to watch this doctor's cool, we called it indifferent, almost robotic interaction with her patient, Jackson. She might have paused, just taken a minute, listened to what he said. I'm tired, I just want to rest. But she ignored that. She couldn't let the pain in, the pain that Jackson was feeling. And by doing that, she really missed a healing opportunity. Not only for Jackson, but for herself. Glued to the safety and privilege of her medical role, she sacrificed a little bit of her humanity that day. I have a lot of stories like that. Seishin is one of the inmates I work with, and I think I've been with him for 16 years. He's actually an ordained Zen priest, the only one in the California state prison system. And a wonderful man. He recently had surgery through the neck, going through the vertebrae to take care of things there. It's pretty serious stuff. He was at Sierra Vista Hospital, ironically the hospital that my wife worked at as the head intensive care nurse over 20 years ago. He was in a room, 3 other inmates. Each inmate had 2 guards with guns. Well, the nurses would come in, and it was like no eye contact. He was shackled to the bed, and I'm sure that that's, of course, for safety, so nobody can escape. But treated in really an inhuman manner. And I get the nurses. I mean, I get the responses. But this is contrasted with another visit to a hospital he had when he was up at Salinas, a prison near Salinas. Totally the opposite. The nurses would come in, yakking with him, eye contact, talking normally. Just a whole different atmosphere. As I'm a hospice chaplain, and we have what are called face sheets. And the face sheets are a synopsis of the medical side of the patient. So it's got the name, the address, date of birth, their sex, medical diagnosis, and it'll say something, some examples. Number 138, endocarditis, valve unspecified. Or C3490, malignant neoplasm of unspecified part, unspecified bronchus or lung. Or N184, chronic kidney disease, stage 4, in parentheses, severe. And that's the medical side of it. And of course, that's not the human side of it. And that's what we try to do going in. So what's your role? What's your identity? Who are you? And please don't misunderstand. Roles absolutely have their place. Thank goodness that we have trained physicians, teachers, waiters and waitresses, whatever it might be. Roles, of course, do play an important function. But isn't there more? In this prison environment, for years, I had a friend of mine, Michael Moran, would come in and with me, I think for 8 years. He's a therapist, and we used to do an exercise with the inmates, and basically would say what we're saying here, what I'm saying here. Who are you? What's your identity? And this is, of course, pushing these categories about gender, ethnicity, role identities, and it kind of invokes this search for who am I? Who am I? And so you can imagine we'd go around this circle of inmates, and they would identify themselves. I'm a black man. I'm Muslim. I'm a murderer. I'm an inmate. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. So we go around the room and then pose the question after everybody has their turn, telling them, when you get asked that, say, I don't know. And what happens? What happens to you? How does that feel? And of course, there's this expansiveness that occurs when they realize they're not just that. All of us have kind of images of people, our ideas of people, and they also, I know it's true in my case, they tend to be pretty static. And this is just my opinion. I think we do that because that's kind of an easier way to do it. To just say, okay, this is my wife, and she always acts this way, so I know what to expect at all times. And I dare say that in many relationships, we encapsulate them here, and then as time goes on, they end up over here. I'm still dealing with the box over here, and things have changed. And maybe that gives rise to a high rate of divorce. Our own views of others can change. Another prison story. One night I do a meditation group, and then another night, this is up at California Men's Colony, I do counsel. And most of you are familiar with counsel. And Jared Side Ocean he's in 22 prisons now statewide. And what they're doing is teaching the inmates to become facilitators of counsel. I've said this to a number of my friends, that it's some of the most powerful work I have done. I'm basically there. I'm part of the circle, but most of the time they're the ones facilitating, and they're the ones doing the prompt. So back in last September, one of the inmates, I think it was 9/12, and he brought up 9/11, and he said, "What comes up for you around 9/11?" And to a person, and this is not unusual, I'm sure it's the same for all of us in this room, everybody knew exactly where they were when 9/11 happened. Now you can imagine at the prison that we've got some guys were not in prison at that time, they were out. Others had been in prison for a long time. I remember one saying he was in AGSEG, they call it, that's in the hole, separated from everybody. And many of them just said, you know what, I didn't give a rat's ass back then. They didn't have any sensitivity to it. They didn't care. But they do now. They have changed. One young man's story, his name is Jihad, and in counsel you're not supposed to share stories, so I got his permission. And I've shared this stories a few times, I think, at the CAW meeting. Jihad, what a name, right? Muslim. And that's struggle or fight against the enemies of Islam. It also means effort. It also means spiritual struggle with one's self against sin. But it's an Arabic origin, effort. So he was not in prison at that time, and then he was asked to go into junior high, 7th grade class, to speak to the students after 9/11 had happened about his faith, about Muslim. So this is his opportunity to go share the faith. Well, pretty creative. He came in with layered clothes on. The outer layer was his Muslim garb. They have it's called a thobe. It's a long robe. Had a prayer cap on, And he asked the question before he began. He said, "Do I look like a terrorist?" And all the kids are in there. "Yep, you do." So he starts sharing about the Muslim tradition, his faith tradition. And of course, talking about that these were pretty radical extremists that were very much a minority. And he shares his feelings about his tradition. As he's doing so, he starts taking off that top layer and then gets down to his civvies and asks the question again, "Do I look like a terrorist?" Well, most of the kids said, "No, you don't." A couple of the kids said, "Yeah, you still do." Goes on talking. This was in San Diego. He's a huge San Diego Charger fan. So the last layer is a San Diego Charger jersey. And then at the end he asked the kids, "Do I look like a terrorist?" And all of them said no. So change does occur on our images. Another story, this is another inmate in my council group, Joe. Joe is one tough son of a bitch. And he knows it, and he's struggled with it. He has anger management issues, and he's been down 23 years, I think, now. And he's just kind of really now grappling with what's going on. And he's to the point he has a board hearing coming up, and that's a big deal in that world when they're gonna, because it's their potential to get parole. So they plan for it, and he's hired an attorney to help him with this cause. And he's written a long time ago. Had actually written a letter to his victim and the family. And in this journey, he came to the realization, actually, he was talking to a paralegal, and she said, really there should be 2 letters. One to the victim and one to the family. And in 23 years, he hadn't realized his impact on others, but finally came to this awakening that, I need to write 3 letters. One to the victim, one to the family, and one to others that I have harmed. And he recalled his hearing date, being in the courtroom, and a young lady that had been there witnessing. He walked into where he had worked, pulled a revolver out, and shot somebody just in front of a lot of people. And this young lady had been traumatized over this. And he finally, after all these years, came to this realization saying, wow, I had an effect on a lot of people. It wasn't just my victim. It wasn't just his family. I'd mentioned parole hearings for the inmates, again, being a big thing. And here's another example, though, of people being fixed. Seishin, who I mentioned earlier, had a hearing, and every time he has a parole hearing, the family has been showing up. And I totally get where they're coming from as well. But I also understand I've been with him for 16 years, and I know Seishin. But they have this image of the murdered this lady's daughter. It was his girlfriend. And so they're stuck back 30-some years ago. He's done, you can't believe the work he's doing. He helped found the hospice, it's only one of 2 hospices in the state prison system. He founded it. He's a member of this meditation group on my Wednesday night group. And I've been there, I think, 16 years. It's over 25 years old. And he was one of the founding members of that. I would trust this guy anywhere. But family are still, he's the murderer. So he couldn't have changed from who he was 30 years ago. A number of us, some of us here, had a cooking class with Ed Brown recently. Ed Brown was one of the first, or I think the first Tenzo at Tassajara. And it was just amazing. You talk about mindfulness. You were using these sharp knives and cutting things, and one of my main takeaways was if we paid that much attention to our own relationships, what a different place this would be. Paying attention, not living with somebody that you have an idea about or an image about. So how do you get to that place of not knowing? Different ways. The first doctor, had dropped into not knowing when she came in with a patient, and Chet has this huge smile on his face. There are some more dramatic ways. These bearing witness retreats that either you've been on or you've certainly heard about offer that. My trip to Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, very first day you go in and you see they do this movie that most of us have seen bits and pieces of it, but I don't know how long it is, like a half hour or something. Just brutal pictures. And then you go into the gas chamber, one of the gas chambers, and they shuttle you in there and shut the lights out. And then they say, I don't know how many were in our group, maybe 150, 200, and they said, they packed in 700 or more into the chamber. So that's your first exposure, and I'm sitting down on a bench outside, and Bernie Glassman comes up and sits next to me, and we're talking. And he's saying, the place drops you into not knowing. And part of that mechanism is that you can't grasp. You can't get your arms around this. It's just like totally overwhelming. And that's dropping you into not knowing. Back to this roles. I deal with caregiving a lot, of course, in the medical community as a hospice chaplain. And there's a huge burnout rate with nurses, caregivers, and many of them are trying to fix things. Many of them are trying to bring about a good death for our patients, whatever that means. And Frank had talked about this, and I'd kind of come to this conclusion beforehand, but he makes this distinction between the word service and the word caregiving. And I love it because it kind of ties to our vows. I vow to serve. I vow to serve. And service speaks to the depth of the heart's intention. It's kind of an embodiment of unselfish values. And from that action, the action, it comes out of that wisdom. And it's so tied into our tenets: not knowing, bearing witness, taking action. And there's another physician, Rachel Naomi Raymond, and I really like this. She talked about helping, fixing, and serving, and that they represent three different ways of life. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as whole. And fixing and helping are really draining. There's so much energy. Serving is renewing. And I really get that sense when I do the chaplaincy work with hospice. It is so revitalizing and renewing. Yeah, sometimes you go home, you've had a tough case, and you just cry. But it is just so powerful, and a tremendous sense of satisfaction. And in serving, you have a sense of gratitude. So what's your role? Who are you today? Ram Dass has a saying, don't be a role, be a soul. I like that. And I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill. Gary Oldman is the actor that plays in that movie. Great movie. And there's one scene in there where he's ready to go into over to Parliament, and it shows his wall. And it's this huge wall. It's all paneled and everything. And he must have 30 hats up on this wall. And he looks at him and he said, which self should I be today? And I'll end with one last story. And this is a story of Tommy and his mom. His mom, Ethel. And it's a very good illustration of form and emptiness in the world. Ethel, his mom, had brain cancer. And she came to live at the Zen Hospice Project when it became impossible for her family to manage her care at home. And her son, Tommy, had Down syndrome. Now, although he was in his teens, he had the emotional, psychological development of a 6-year-old. He came to see his mom very frequently. And as he did, he made kind of a good relationship, had a good relationship with Frank. So the morning his mom, Ethel, passes, Frank made the call to the family and the husband, Peter. And Peter asked, what should I do about Tommy? Because Frank had said, well, do you want to come over to the body, and see the body? And Frank suggested you bring Tommy along. Peter kind of hesitated and he said, I'm going to talk to his therapist first to see what she says. So a little while later he calls back, and the therapist doesn't think it's too good of an idea to bring Tommy in there. She said that when she, the therapist, was a little girl, she went to a family funeral and was forced to kiss her dead grandfather. And that apparently traumatized her. And she thought the same would happen to Tommy. So Dad pauses for a little bit, and then he adds, he said, I don't know what to do because Tommy's asking to see his mom. Frank said, well, why don't you bring Tommy and invite his therapist to come too? So an hour later, the doorbell at the hospice home rings, and there's Peter, the dad, Tommy, with his therapist and a few other family members. And Tommy has this small Instamatic camera, hanging around his neck. And Frank invited them in and says, hi, Tommy, what are you doing? He says, I see you have your camera. What do you want to take pictures of today? And he smiled. And he said, you, Mr. Buddha, and my mom. So they go in. They had a big statue of Buddha. And so he gets his pictures with the Buddha and with Frank. And then they go upstairs to where Ethel is. So everyone in the crowd is pretty apprehensive at that point. How's Tommy going to react to seeing his dead mom? So Frank walks hand in hand with Tommy up to the bedside. And Tommy spontaneously just reached over the bed rail and kissed his mom on the forehead, just like he always did. And Tommy turned and looked up at Frank and said, not with any fear, but just out of curiosity, and asked, where has all that gone? Form and emptiness. What was animated, full of life before is now empty. Tommy could absolutely sense the absence of his mom, even though her body was still there. Silence fell over the room when he asked the question. Most of the adults are kind of squirming nervously about, what are we going to say? And Frank said what he usually does. I don't know, Tommy. What do you think? Tommy thought about it for a minute and then launched into this very animated description out of his imagination. The story, he had a couple stories. One was included images of a butterfly emerging from a cocoon and scenes from Terminator 2. If you remember that, where the humans morph from one shape into another. So when he did this, everybody in the room kind of relaxed. They could see Tommy wasn't frightened. In fact, he was very curious about what was absent. What happened? Where did she go? So they went, drank tea and Coca-Cola, and visited. Before the whole family left, Frank had sensed that Tommy might want to see his mom again for a last time. And so the two of them had built up so much trust over time, the dad agreed, says, okay, that's fine, go ahead. So the room clears where Ethel is, and Tommy moves up to his mom's bedside again, and he asks a few more questions. When you're dead, can you feel? Frank said, I don't know if dead people can feel, Tommy, but can you feel your mom? Yes, I can. But she's not moving. Yeah, when people die, they don't breathe or eat or talk anymore. This seemed to satisfy Tommy. And then Frank said, Tommy, if there's anything you want to say to your mom or do for your mom, now's really a good time to do it. So he watched as Tommy gently touched his mother's arm, feeling its texture and the changing temperature of the body. And after a moment, he did what Frank said was the sweetest and most remarkable thing. Leaning over his mom's body, he smelled her from head to foot. Frank said it reminded him of watching a white-tailed deer fawn once on a country road, whose mother had been killed by a car, and the fawn had done the exact same thing, was sniffing its mom. Of course, Tommy's going to go on and will still need to grieve and take time to understand, come to grips with the loss of his mom. But at that moment, there wasn't anything more that needed to be said or done. I doubt many grown-ups would allow themselves to have that intimacy with death. I suppose we became more intimate with form and emptiness in our everyday life. I'm way out of time. I had just a short poem at the end that I loved. Wisdom tells me I am nothing. Love tells me I'm everything. Between the two, my life flows.